Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone, the Director of the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice at the Urban League. And tonight we're having a special program. We're excited to have uh, Ann Burnett talking to us about law and particular aspects of law, particularly for those interested in perhaps going to law school. So on behalf of the Center and the Urban League, I want to thank Ann and the interns and all the work that they've done to make this possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Sophie Walker, who will be doing introductions.
Yeah, so before we get into the bios, I just wanted to introduce the pre-law cohort of this internship group. We've worked together to find and look into different law programs at different universities across the US, research um, and go out into try to get some town hall speakers throughout these colleges. We've had Anne Burnett so graciously decided that she would tell us a little bit about law and her career path. And yeah, so if we bring it to Stephanie to talk a little bit about who Anne is and, the law specialty that she's in.
Yeah, of course. Well, a little bit about our speaker, Anne Burnett. She is the Foreign and International Law Librarian at the University of Georgia and has been since 1996. And she serves as the primary provider of references services for the International Foreign and Comparative Law collections and is a member of the library's research team. And she also teaches courses in international legal research, advanced legal research, and the LL.M Legal System of the United States course. And she had received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Nevada, a Juris Doctor cum laude from the University of Georgia School of Law, and a Master in Library and Information Science from the University of Texas in Austin. And she is also a member of the State Bars of California and Nevada, and she is active in the American Association of Law Libraries, the International Federation of Library Associations, and the American Society of International Law. So she has done quite a bit in the law field. And with that, I believe we should turn it over to her to get started on the wonderful presentation she has prepared for us today.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm real happy to be here. I hope you all are having a good summer so far. And I was just really interested in hearing about your series of town halls, and I think it's really exciting. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I just wanted to make sure that you guys can see it. Are you seeing it all right? And hopefully the recording is picking it up as well.
Yes,
So
we can see it.
great. So I wanted to talk a little bit sort of about just legal research just in general and sort of some of the changes it's gone through. And then you'd asked me to talk a little bit about international law careers, but I'm going to talk a little tiny bit about how international legal research differs from US legal research. And then I'll talk a little bit about international law careers as well. So one thing I just wanted to see if you guys had any thoughts at all about how much time lawyers spend doing legal research as compared to other things that they do. So, lawyers spend time in court if they're the type of lawyer who goes to court or meeting with clients or drafting contracts, that type of thing. But how much time do you think, what percentage of their time do you think they spend actually doing legal research, like looking for the law?
I feel like it'll be about almost 80% of their time. I feel like they spend a lot of time just sitting in their offices and just going through papers and papers and papers.
Well, not quite that much, but it is a sizable amount of their time. So, and hopefully on your screens you can see it. Some of you might have something blocking it, but for lawyers, overall, it's a little bit under 20% of their time. But that's still a sizable chunk of their time. And then newer lawyers and typically younger lawyers are spending more than that, about 25% or a little bit more than 25% for lawyers with under 10 years of experience. And these stats come from an American Bar Association report from 2023, which was the last year that I could find this particular stat drawn from. But that is a big chunk of time, and lawyers' time is really valuable. So it's a lot of time. And the way that that legal research used to be taught, some law schools even had upper class law students teaching it. A lot of times it was sort of an afterthought in a legal writing course. But law firms and other legal employers a few years ago started expressing the desire to have law students come out of law school with more well-developed, more rounded legal research experience. They wanted them to not know more than just that you can find cases in, case reporters, that type of thing, but like to really be able to take a fact pattern and to be able to understand, what the legal issues were that were arising out of that fact pattern and what types of legal resources they needed to find, and to be able to do all of this efficiently. And so a lot of law schools started working on putting more effort into teaching legal research. And so that's kind of been an evolution in the way that legal research is taught in law schools. Now at this law school, for example, the University of Georgia School of Law, legal research is a standalone class that's taught for credit, and it's graded, as opposed to just being a piece of a separate of another class, like, for example, a legal writing class, or just something that's taught by upper class law students. So at our law school, it's taught by law librarians. I think that's kind of more the trend when it is a standalone course now. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit off track from talking about how it's taught in law schools and talk a little bit about some changes to the bar exam. So those of you who are thinking about going to law school, by the time if you're an undergrad now, by the time you get out, it is very likely that the state that you take the bar exam in will be doing, administering something called the Next Gen Bar Exam. So some states are starting next summer of 26. They'll be switching to what's called the Next Gen Bar Exam. Florida and Georgia are in a wave of states that they're looking to start the Next Gen Bar Exam in 2028. So it's a pretty big change to the way that they administer the bar exam. And why am I talking about that right in the middle here of talking about legal research? Because they're adding foundational lawyering skills, and one of those, legal research, will feature prominently on the Next Gen Bar Exam. And so this is making it even more crucial for law schools to produce law graduates who are really adept at effective legal research. So we're paying a lot of attention to this in legal academia. So if you're switching back now to just talking more about legal research and not scary things like the bar exam, I have law students outside, or recent law graduates outside my office door right now who are studying for the current bar exam. But so what kinds of things do you look for if you're doing legal research? Do you guys have any ideas of, like, when you're looking for, I've already mentioned cases and case reporters, but do you have ideas about the kinds of things you're looking for when you are doing legal research?
I think that one thing that would be really good to do while you're looking at the research is brushing up on the actual law that you're thinking about, and if there's multiple laws, I feel like there's so many that everyone has to memorize that looking and researching those and making sure that you're well adept in what each law actually means would help with legal research.
Yeah. And one thing you're reminding me of or making me think of is the last thing on my list here, well, besides just the overall answers, which is your end goal, but the bullet point above that is called secondary law, and that encompasses all kinds of things. But I'm talking there about things like articles about the law and books that are not the law itself, but books about it that help explain it and also might alert you to updates or developments in the law. So, but overall, you're looking for court cases and statutes and court rules and procedural rules and regulations that come out from the agencies, either at the federal level or at the state level, and administrative decisions from the administrative agencies. And one thing that can help you with all this is what we call secondary law, that kind of can point you to the most important cases and statutes in whatever area of law that you're looking for, and can help you to understand it too. So these are the kinds of things that we work with our law students to help them to find these things the most efficiently that they can, and to get them to those answers that they are seeking. So when I was a law student, and this was many, many decades ago, the way they had us learn this was they would say, find a court case that does, this, and find a statute that does, the other thing. And we called them treasure hunts, or like Easter egg hunts. But when you're actually practicing law, nobody tells you to just find a court case. You get real live people with real live issues and fact patterns, and you have to figure out what the court case, or what you're looking for in court cases and what you're looking for in the statutes. So the way we teach it now is we provide hypothetical situations, and our students have to figure out what the issues are and what kinds of cases will help them figure out what the law is, what the courts have deemed the law to be in those areas. So it's definitely a more laborious process, and it can be frustrating when you're first learning how to do it. But it's part of the process of becoming a lawyer. So the other thing I want to talk about are what types of resources do lawyers use for legal research. And way back here, I had, these classic law books on the shelves. And quite honestly, you'll see a lot of these now used as movie set props. We certainly, we have a lot of them here, and people use them, but very little, to be honest. And we use them as, we will continue to house them, and they're important for archival purposes, but almost everybody's using online resources now. Print is very rarely used. Some people, and I'm one of them, I actually do like using print for statutes a lot of the time, depending on some of the circumstances. So there are times when I'm really glad we still have updated print statutes, but and hopefully you guys can see the percentages on my screen. My view of all you is kind of blocking what the percentages are on the right, but you can see that a general search engine or directory is one of the most frequently used resources to start a research project. And they're talking about Google here for the most part. And a lot of people think that a librarian will be like horrified by that. And it's like, I will tell you, I use Google all the time because sometimes I don't know like the terms of art that I need to use for what I'm researching. And, sometimes it's the quickest way for me to kind of figure out, what I'm doing, because I get asked to look for all kinds of things in this job. And sometimes it's the quickest way and I'm not paying anything to use it. And there is absolutely no shame whatsoever in using Google. But you have to cut bait pretty quickly. You use it. If you find something that's helpful, you take it and run, but you do not go through page after page of Google results trying to find something useful. So fee-based online resource, that's referring to databases we have like Westlaw and Lexis. And, I know Stephanie's a student here at the University of Georgia. So we have campus-wide access to Westlaw here that the University Libraries provides. Your institutions probably provide something like that either to Westlaw or Lexis. All of our law students get individual password access to both of those. And the law school version is a little bit different than the campus, but they're incredibly rich resources for researching case law, statutes, regulations, all those secondary resources I'm telling you about. They have a lot of those in there. So they're really good, but generally expensive resources to use. Law firms and other types of legal employers and academia pay a lot of money for these fee-based online resources. So use them while you're in school because they're a really good resource. So firm resource, those like a lot of firms are building their own, or they may have like a bank of briefs that they have developed, firm that they will use. You see the very small percentage of print materials, 4%, that lawyers start projects with. State bar sponsored free legal research. So pretty much every state now, their bar association provides lawyers with databases that they can use for free. These are things like Fast Case. And they're good, but they're not as rich in resources or as they don't have as many bells and whistles as something like Lexis or Westlaw. So I think that a lot of the calculation by the attorneys is if your time is more valuable, then you may be willing to pay the money for the more costly resources like Westlaw or Lexis, just depending on what you're doing. And then government websites. So this is when a lot of agencies have really good content on their websites. Things like the EPA, or like in Georgia, our Natural Resources Division has very good legal content on their website. Like, for example, in Georgia, the Natural Resources Division tells you when they have new regulations that they are proposing, and they will tell you which of the what statutory authority underlies those proposed regulations. So anyway, the government websites are a very rich resource. I'm actually kind of surprised that they only account for 2% of this graph. So anyway, those are the types of resources that lawyers use, at least to start their research projects. So what's missing from this list? We don't see anything on here about AI. And I'll tell you right now that everybody in legal technology world, in law school technology world, is completely abuzz about AI. It really is changing. It really is changing the landscape for legal practice. was talking to a solo practitioner here in town a couple of weeks ago, and he uses AI pretty much every day in his legal practice. Something he used to would have hired an associate to do, he's actually working solo now because he's doing a lot of this work himself using AI for things like reviewing contracts and drafting contract terms. So, you know, with that, we'll say, will AI replace lawyers? The common phrase now we say is, or answer is no, but lawyers who use AI will replace lawyers who don't use AI. So it's part of our job here at the law school to help our law students learn how to use it effectively. So we are constantly trying to keep up with it. We have added at the University of Georgia, we added, I think last fall was the first year that we added a course in AI and the law, and it was very popular with our students. So, so what's it good at? You know, these are some of the things, a blank page problem, when you just are staring at your computer and you can't even get started. Sometimes you can just, AI can help you get started with drafting something. It's sometimes okay at summarizing things, you know, maybe you can plug in a bunch of cases that you've pulled and it will help you to summarize them. It is pretty darn good at comparing contract terms and suggesting language. And same thing with comparing briefs and suggesting language. And then with judicial and litigation analytics, looking at data about judges and courts and about lawyers and law firms and that type of thing. So, but it also makes a lot of stuff up still. And it's something you have to be very careful about. So, whoops, I thought I had another slide in there, but anyway, one thing we're talking about a lot right now is agentic AI, where it's not just, you know, your generative AI. I feel kind of weird saying just generative AI because that's still, like, you know, still fairly new for us. But agentic AI is actually taking something that maybe was a step-by-step process with AI, where you would ask ChatGPT to do something and then say, okay, now do this, and then taking the results and say, okay, now do the next step with it. Now you can feed the information into an agentic AI, and it is capable of multi-step processes, and you know, maybe you can give it a situation with a contract and it will draft the contract for you after looking up the relevant legal research and suggesting strategies for you, all at the same time. So at least that's the promise. All throughout all of this, attorneys need to be really careful that they're not dropping the ball with, you know, their responsibilities. And this is just, you know, a little representation of some of the ethical considerations, but you still have to always be sure that you're protecting your client's confidentiality, that you're not using AI that might compromise the confidentiality of your client, that you are still checking everything and making sure that what you're providing are accurate and competent services, that you're not, you know, billing inappropriately, and that you're still, you know, complying with lawyer advertising restrictions. So this was a January 19, 2024 opinion by the Florida Bar. So I don't know if you guys have heard about the lawyers getting sanctioned. It just keeps happening. I'm guessing that these lawyers in 2025 didn't hear about the lawyers in 2024 who were getting sanctioned for filing briefs in the courts that had made up cases. They used AI to generate briefs, and the briefs included fake cases that AI just made up. And I've played around with it a little bit, and I've had it make up cases too. So I also, one of the things I've used it for is just helping me generate citations, like the correct format of something that I already knew existed, like a treaty, for example. I already knew the treaty existed, and I just have it generate a correctly formatted citation, and it would get like half of it right, and then it kind of made up half of the citation. Not all the time, but you know, so I still had to check it to make sure that it wasn't just making something up. And you know, when I pointed out the part that was incorrect, it apologized. So that was very interesting. That was with ChatGPT. And that was about 6 months ago, so it may be better now. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about how legal research changes when you're talking about international law. So I mentioned cases, statutes, regulations, that type of thing. So when you're in the international arena, your sources of law change to a certain degree. So take a look at this. This is a U.S. District Court decision. And they have here cited some New York law, a foreign law. This is a Singapore law, and an international agreement, the Hague Evidence Convention. So, you know, and I'll tell you that, like, when I was in law school, I had, you know, classmates who didn't want to have anything to do with international law. And they say, I'm never going to do that, so I don't need to know any of this stuff. This is a U.S. District Court opinion. So international law or transnational law, it does not just affect people who decide to go have, you know, swanky careers practicing international law in The Hague or in Belgium or something. It can affect all kinds of lawyers. So, but if you're talking about pure public international law, something that a lot of times when people say international law, they're talking about kind of an umbrella term. But if it's just what we call public international law, the International Court of Justice in its what's called the statute of the court in Article 38, they listed what they considered the sources of public international law. And so that's, and a lot of people think that these 4 points, A, B, C, and D, are hierarchical, but that's also debated and something that you might find about 1 million law review articles about. But the first one they list are international conventions. So what you might think of as treaties. And then the second one they list is international custom or customary international law. So these are very different than anything you would be researching if you were researching US law. And then general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. And then all the way down in D, they start talking about judicial decisions is the first time court cases are even mentioned. So you can see how it's very different than what you would be researching in just US law. And then that customary international law, this is kind of a slippery little concept too. So it's the general and consistent practice of states followed by them from a sense of legal obligation. And then you will see lawyers trying to persuade the court that whatever they are claiming is customary international law, they're trying to provide evidence that it's a consistent practice and that the countries are doing it because they feel obliged to do it. And so they're looking for evidence of all that. So now all of a sudden, we're looking for international relations documents and, you know, things like, are there court decisions by domestic courts that say that the country is doing it because they feel obliged to do it under international law? So it gets kind of tricky all of a sudden. So, but under that big kind of umbrella term of international law, you might be also looking at something that I think of more as transnational law, and private international law. So if you think about things like family law, but that involve more than one country, so like international adoption, or say still under family law, if you have two parents and they get divorced and one of them moves to another country and you're trying to enforce child support by the parent, in one country, you're trying to enforce it in the child support order in a second country. That's comes under this umbrella term of private international law. So here you're looking at doing research that involves the laws of more than one country. There may be a treaty or treaties that are also involved. You may, if it involves like the sale of goods or other types of transactions, you may have contracts involved that you're looking at that have things like choice of law clauses or choice of jurisdiction clauses. And you also might have international arbitration involved. So we get a lot of calls for research in those areas here at the law school. So I mentioned that family law just as an example. This is from the U.S. State Department's private international law page. They have, this is the one specifically for family law, and they list the international agreements to which the U.S. is a party that deal with family law. So they have one on international child abduction, one on intercountry adoption, and then one, I mentioned the issue of child support involving more than one country. So they have some resources there that can help. So that was all just to give you an idea of how legal research is very different if you're doing in the international arena, but the issues of like legal analysis and that type of thing still apply. So the other thing that we were going to talk about today is about where international lawyers work. So there are a lot of places that you can end up besides being an international law librarian at a law school like I am. So law firms and companies, so you can have law firms that have clients who engage in international business, or companies who have in-house counsel that do the same. I have a classmate of mine who's working for a pharmaceutical company that's based in the U.S., but they're global, and because they do work in the European Union, which has a big data privacy regulation that it's pretty tricky. He's based in Brussels, and he's like their privacy officer. So he knows a whole lot about European Union privacy law, and that's how he's made his career. So you can have intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, and again, the European Union. There are quite many intergovernmental organizations. The UN is kind of the big granddaddy example. And they have many different divisions that have that employ lawyers. I did pull these bios of these two women who work in the Office of Legal Affairs at the UN, just to give you an idea. So the top one, Evelyn Campos Sanchez, before she got into the Office of Legal Affairs, she actually worked for some international tribunals and the World Bank. So, and then the bottom one, she worked for government before she didn't say which government, but she worked for government as an international attorney before she started working for the UN. So non-governmental organizations, NGOs, so I'm talking here about things like Greenpeace or the International Committee of the Red Cross, Amnesty International, they do a lot of international law, and they can be very influential with intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations. And they also have employed quite a few international attorneys. So that's another way that you can get involved. And then international tribunals, I mentioned that this woman on the top had worked for some international courts. So like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, tribunals like that have staffs, and those are usually made up of a good number of attorneys. And then I mentioned governments. For example, we talked about the State Department. I showed you that private international law, family law site. But in addition to the State Department, like you might not think, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture hires international attorneys, international law attorneys, because, you know, we have a number of treaties that involve agriculture, and there's export-import law involved. So one of my law school classmates went to work for the USDA straight out of law school. There's many different types of opportunities. The Department of Justice has rule of law initiatives overseas. So, you know, you think of the people in the DOJ working as like U.S. attorneys here in the U.S., but there are also DOJ attorneys working in other countries as well. And then academia. So I guess, you know, I'm working in academia as an international law librarian, but there are also law professors and people in kind of what you think of as think tanks, you know, or research centers in law schools who are international law experts. So how do you prepare for a career in international law? I would think if you really are thinking about it, when you're choosing to go to law school, I would look for one with a good international law program. I'm evidence of that you don't have to go to New York to find one. You know, University of Georgia is proof of that. There are places in Florida. There's all kinds of law schools that have good international law programs. And that will give you many more opportunities, including some of the things on the next couple slides. Internships. I'm just going to say that it's going to be hard to get a job like with an intergovernmental organization, you know, or some of these other jobs if you don't have any experience. And so internships are a good way to get experience. And if you're at a law school that you know that has an organized program, that might help. And also, hopefully you can find ones that you don't have to do for free, because I know that can be a hardship. So I was able to work for a firm in England the summer after my first year of law school, and it was a fantastic experience. And so I took advantage of that, and they actually paid, you know, like what they would pay one of their clerks. So you know, just kind of look at the kinds of opportunities, but also, you know, you can try to search for these kinds of internships on your own as well. Participate in international law moot court. There's the Jessup competition is one of the most famous one, but there's also an international arbitration moot court. There's an international mediation moot competition. This is a really great way, especially if you enjoy public speaking and you know, want to do some kind of moot court experience. I think you might really enjoy it. So look up to see if you can get involved in that while you're in law school. And while you're an undergrad, the International Law Students Association has just very recently, like within the last 2 years, started an undergraduate international law moot court competition as well. I believe it's held at the University of Indiana. I'm pretty sure this past spring was the first time they held the actual competition. But I haven't been able to find a whole lot more about it. But so you might look to see if it's something you're interested in, you might look to see if your school can put together a team. I think it's about $250 a team to participate. And you can write for an international law journal. This is just a smattering, but a lot of law schools have an international law journal. I did it. It was a very good experience, and you can learn a lot about a lot of different areas of law if you are on the student editor board, because then you're editing, articles about all kinds of topics in international law. And I mentioned the International Law Students Association. The American Society of International Law is a great group to get involved in. And if they have law student rates for joining, but if the law school you're at is a member of ASL, then as a student, you can get a free ASL student membership. So I hope you guys remember that by the time you're in law school. And last thing I want to say is talk to your professors and other mentors. It's one of my greatest regrets is that I didn't take advantage of all the great mentors that I had in law school, because I didn't want to bother them. And then when I came back to law school as a professor and a law librarian, I realized that they all wanted me to bother them. They wanted me to take advantage of their expertise. So talk to your professors and other mentors. And that's it.
Thank you for that. And I believe now we will move on to questions if anyone has any.
I have a question.
Okay.
Based on your knowledge, do you think that there'll be change? I mean, any significant changes in international law is interesting, but do you think there might be changes in the enforcement mechanisms of international law anytime soon? Because that's like a controversial part of international law.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be hard. It's hard because with the veto power in the Security Council, I don't know how they will make that happen, to be honest. But I guess they could just completely redo the entire United Nations.
I had a question. Throughout your presentation, you were talking about separate sections of international law and how all of the different sections, how they differ from each other. And then you also talked about how your experience as a law librarian for international law. Part A of my question is, how did you decide before you became a law librarian kind of what specialty you wanted to go into? And when you decided to become a law librarian, was it always your idea to become an international law librarian, or was it, did you learn that after you became one?
Well, I knew that I was interested in international law when I started law school. I was working for a law firm as a paralegal, and I was really involved in Amnesty International. So I was super interested in human rights and international human rights. And so when I came, so that's one of the reasons I came to UGA, was because I knew they had a good international law program. And I was putting myself through school, so I was trying to go somewhere that wasn't gonna, put me in, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And so that part, and I took advantage of pretty much every international law thing I could while I was here, except for the justice. I didn't do international moot court. But I also worked for the law library beginning my second year because I needed money. And I loved it. And I was really kind of officious and like started answering people's questions that I had no business answering their questions. And the law librarians got a hold of me and said, you really need to go to library school and you be a law librarian. And I was already committed to working for a judge in Nevada. and there was personal reasons for that, why I chose to take that job, and go back home. But, so that it was in my back of my head this whole time while I was working in, for the court and for the legislature, that at some point I was gonna go get my library degree. But, you know, once you started working, it's hard to like kind of go back to school. But I finally did. And so I knew I wanted a job as an international law librarian. It was kind of just waiting to see when one opened up. And I got very lucky because I stayed in touch with the librarians here, and they did not have an international specific position here at the time I was in school. But about a year and a half after I got my library degree, they created one, because they just had so many programs, and we had so many faculty here who were doing research in the area. We had the journal. We had Jessup teams that were very, every year were very competitive, and very strong international law society. And so they let me know that the job was coming open, and I applied for it. So yeah, I knew when I was in library school that I wanted to get an international law librarian position, but I just had to wait for one to be open, and I got really lucky that one got open back here.
I have a quick question about AI. So you mentioned how it's becoming obviously more popular in the law profession. Is there a major difference between how it's used for domestic law versus international?
Well, the only thing I can say is that it seems to be more developed for domestic law, and there is VLEX is a database that is doing a lot more with foreign law, so that you can start comparing different countries, but they still don't have, I want to say maybe they're up to 20 countries now. But it's like the rest of the world maybe is not quite as developed as the US legal market is for AI at this point. So at least it's not quite like when I look for stuff in Chat GPT, it's only got US law in it. And the one I mentioned, VLEX, that's a subscription database, which we have, but it doesn't have the generative AI in our subscription yet. So it's not, at least not as widely used that I'm aware of. So we have a program here with about 20 foreign lawyers who come a year to get an additional degree beyond their law degree. And I work with them. I teach a class on US law with them. And so I'm looking forward to talking with them. Most of them have been practicing law for a while already when they get here. I'm looking forward to talking with them to see if any of them are using AI in their work.
You were talking a little bit about the different resources that law students and even lawyers use when researching. And you said that you were surprised about how low the government was at 2%. As a law librarian, are those ones that you prefer over other resources, or do you just think that it's just surprising in general?
It may just be a matter of I'm just so familiar with them. So I go to a lot of them. And I was a legislative attorney, and I worked with agencies a lot. So I guess I'm kind of so familiar with a lot of them. And one thing to note too is a lot of that content will show up in a Google search. So when the attorneys were responding to that survey, they said that they started their research with a general search engine. Their results probably included some of that government content. So they may not have started with the government site, but I would not be surprised if their results included some of that government content. And of course, the fee-based research databases includes a lot of that as well, like the agency regulations and that content, their administrative decisions, that stuff is in Lexis and Westlaw. So
To touch back on AI, do you think when it comes to AI and like international law, do you think it's more harmful or beneficial?
I mean, it's definitely both. I'm pretty excited by it, to be honest, because I think it's taken away some of the more boring kind of sort of drudgery things and it'll give attorneys time to do some of the more sort of higher level work. But I do think people need to be careful. So
For most of the, if not all of the people in this cohort are thinking about law school but haven't exactly started applying just yet. And I was wondering for um just people thinking about it or people who might be going back to school, what is a piece of advice for looking into law schools and kind of deciding what area you want to go into?
boy, well, I can't tell you how many of my classmates are in a different area of law than what they thought they were going to go into, like when they were a third year law student. So I don't even think you should like try to decide what area of law you're going to go into as an undergrad, because I mean, you may get to law school and you'll find that you're totally interested by tax law and you had no idea, like that sounded horrible to you. I'm basing this on a former student who she ended up getting an LL.M, an additional degree in tax law. And she never thought that would be interesting to her. So I we have a lot of books about law school. I would read about it. I mean, I'm a content info gatherer, so that's something that I did, and there's a lot of online content too. Um, but just so you kind of know as much about it. And like about the careers that you can have, but I think I mean, you guys are kind of doing it now already, you know more about law school than I did, way more than I did at this point. Um, so, talk to people who are in law school if you can. I know Stephanie asked me something earlier and I was like, I don't know. I was in that position 40 years ago. So I'm actually going to talk to some current law students to kind of find the answer to a specific question she asked me. But I would talk to law students and if at all possible, more recent law school graduates to kind of get their perspectives on things.
Seeing as we are getting close to time, does anyone have like any final questions they would like to ask or anything that just kind of popped up in their mind that they would like to, get get out of their chest, I guess?
I had a question. What do you see as what has been the biggest impact of AI on legal research in the law?
Hmm. I think just the time savings, honestly. I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I call it my secretary, my executive assistant, and content writer. I have
Yeah.
3 people working for me, and their name is ChatGPT.
Yeah.
It's just
I mean,
amazing.
it saves so much time, you know.
Seconds. You can do things in seconds.
I do an oral argument problem with the foreign lawyers. You know, it's like a mini moot court
Mhm.
assignment, and I create fake cases, you know, and a fake complaint and answer, like a little court record. And that would take me, you know, honestly, it would take me 2 weeks before,
Yeah,
and now it takes me like a day and a half
yeah,
to do all of that. And mostly the most of that time is just how long it takes me, the creative part in my mind, to come up with it. But like, I will just say, you know, create a case that does X, Y, and Z, and I'll give it 5 sentences of the details that I want, and it turns out a 2.5
yeah,
page case, and it's
yeah,
I spend 3 minutes editing it because it
yeah.
does a good job.
You know, I used to coach Jessup Moot Court,
Oh, okay.
and we actually were quite successful at the University of Connecticut and at Gonzaga, where I coached there as well. But when I look back, if I had had ChatGPT back then, I would have been able to do so much with those students and coaching and helping them prepare, you know. But everything is yes, saving time is definitely, and it's got to be impacting the legal profession.
Yeah. The challenge is it changes every day, and there's so many products coming out, and
Hmm.
you know, we're trying to keep up with it, but it's a challenge. And then,
Yeah,
you know, in academia, there's also a challenge in, you know, assessment, and you know, we still want people to learn how to think. Uh, you know,
yeah, that's going to be really, really hard when already they can't write because they use a phone. And yeah, it's a challenge.
but it's good. Like in our research classes, we say, you know, well, try it not using AI and try it using AI and see what the results are, and you
Hmm.
know, and have the students actually assess the differences, and it's very interesting, and they're fascinated by it themselves. So yeah.
Well, on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League and the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice, I want to thank you for being with us again, Anne. And I'll let Sophie or whoever is managing this close us out.
Yeah. I wanted to say something before Stephanie closes it out. Just shameless plug for the internship that we're in right now. I think it does, as you were saying about talking to people in law and really, you know, seeing how people view it. I think that the Jackson Urban League definitely helps with that, and it works, you know, they help us to not only create the town halls, but really think about who we should be talking to, and really expand our horizons on what law school is and how to get involved in it. But yeah, so Stephanie was the one who found our amazing speaker. I wanted to give her the floor for the final say before we close out.
Oh, thank you. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and thank you for giving us your time, and to Miss Burnett for also being here for us and giving us basically this well of information that we can all certainly utilize. And with that, I think, oh, right on time actually. It's right at 8 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and close out for now. Thank you everyone for being here, and see you in probably one of the other town halls as well if you decide to attend. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Hi.